did you guys enjoy the presentation last week?
It was like,
We sure did.
We got starred out.
We like to do the fire hose technique.
Yeah.
We like to blast you.
Partially by
goal.
partially intentional. I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah, it is.
Knew
yes.
more than I ever knew about
Yeah.
the universe.
But I think the one thing with a lot of the presentations where you're hit with a lot, it's more just to give you at least, hopefully in the back of your mind, even if you don't retain all of what you heard, you're like, I know I heard something like about the expansion of the universe, or I heard something about, these issues. You at least know that the resources are out there. Yep.
Brian, I wanted to ask you too about the YouTube sites again, for sure. I tried to take them down in my notes, but I wanted to make sure of the ones that you had mentioned in the presentation last week. You said you had a list of them or had them, and I had,
Okay.
I had a couple. Dr. Davis, I'm guessing I can just YouTube that and it'll probably show up. Would it be Dr. Davis?
You could probably just put that on a,
Or Dr. Craig?
Dr. Craig
Okay.
is, yeah.
Oh, those, very interesting. This came out since the last time we met. Dr. Craig came out with a book called The Search for the Real Atom. It was interesting. I have the book. It just released last week. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. It's a pretty thick book. I think it's like 600 pages. But in the interview, he had some very interesting things to say. Some of them very heterodox or very non-orthodox when it came to Christianity as a whole. He made reference, he does not believe in original sin. So there's things that are starting to come out with some of Craig's stuff, and Craig is very anti-young earth. Really, even to the point that even old earthers look at him and say, come on, what are you doing? I don't know why. So with Craig, I'm actually going to be using less and less of his materials. And so as you use those materials that Brian had, those are great materials, but be careful. Those videos stand alone, but he is starting to really move into areas that make me question.
yeah.
And then another one was iamsecond.com, Ryan, was that one?
Yeah.
And was there a third one?
There was some on that sheet that you got. So I think that sheet had the
Okay.
different ones on it.
Okay.
The videos that I showed were at the beginning of class were the Dr. Craig videos.
Okay. All right.
And we can get you a link for that. I'll try to look that
And-
link up and get you a link for those.
Did you send that to Pam as well?
We will.
Okay, so Pam, we'll send that out to you. I have your 2 email addresses. I'll give those to Brian. And so we'll make sure that those videos that were used in Brian's last week presentation, we'll make sure that they're there. Okay? Yes, you're welcome. So we do, so with him, he kind of provided, accidentally, because I thought I may have had COVID. Maybe you guys didn't know because Nathan, yeah.
We thought, maybe we shouldn't be here either, because we stood in line and this.
Yeah, with us. But I think no one ever tested positive. So it was all good. So we were all good. But it gave a good segue because then Brian could actually do his presentation on the universe. Now, when it comes to astronomy, that is Brian's love. So he is probably in the office here, done most of the research and has most of the resources, and he's very resourceful even if he doesn't. So if you have questions when it comes to cosmology, make sure that you ask Brian, let us know, because we'll definitely do the research. But really, so what we're doing this week, we're actually on week 3, even though it's not week 3. Or no, not week 3, we're on week 5. It's getting all confused, isn't it? Yes, we are on week 5 because we'll be going over chapter 3. So we moved his that maybe was towards the end of the course that's now in the beginning. Now, remember, we're always a week behind with tactics because no one had their book. So really, we're going over chapter 3, in I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, which primarily deals with the cosmological argument and the acronym that they use, SURGE. Okay? Then in Tactics, we're actually dealing with chapters 4 and 5, which we were introduced to the Columbo tactic, and we all know Columbo here. Well, Brian may not. Do you know Columbo, Brian?
I've seen a tiny bit.
A tiny bit?
Not much.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So Columbo, but we actually get into the first two Columbo questions in chapters 4 and 5. So that is what we'll go over. Now, for this week, because now the Bible reading, we haven't slowed down on. So really, if you've been doing a chapter a day, we should be in Genesis 35 through Genesis 35. Is that where you are, Dean?
I
Yes.
sometimes that fell asleep.
That's okay. So, and you guys, it's interesting because this is the first time I've ever done it in this exact format. So we're starting to see if there's little hiccups here and there, it can get a little confusing. So if you have any questions, please text me and I will let you know. Yes?
So Brian talked about the cosmological argument last week.
He did talk a little bit about that. Great.
And then,
A little bit.
Okay, because it's been a long time
Oh,
since I've
really?
seen that presentation of this.
okay, and then so this week, we're still on the cosmological argument that's you.
We are going to deal with the cosmological. Now, did Brian actually go into the actual, the syllogism, the actual premises and everything? Do you remember?
Here, I'm trying to find.
It was in the video that I played, but I did not cover it.
Dr. Craig.
But I did not cover it specifically.
Okay.
Beyond that.
Okay. Yeah,
We'll definitely get into that. And right now, the PowerPoints are going to be pretty minimal, primarily because my computer, really we're looking at getting a new computer for AOI that can run everything we're trying to do without lagging. Because poor Pam, it kind of lags and skips. So a lot of it is going to be discussion. So that we're not making it. And then Pam, make sure if you have any questions, just chat them in. You know how to chat, right? No. Okay, then just talk loud and we'll hear you. And so ask questions and we will go from there. So in the beginning, there was a great surge, but let's first start with, and hopefully, okay, see? We're already having technical difficulties. This will help. Okay, there we go. So we're going to do it, and basically the format of this class is, I don't want to read the book to you, so you guys are coming in, hopefully going over the information. And then it's just kind of elaborating on it and answering questions and maybe giving different perspectives, different analogies, trying to make it understood more in context of maybe personal things that are happening in your life, people that you're dealing with, or asking the questions. So the first one we're going to do, obviously, is we will start with the scripture. So going through Genesis 35, did you guys mark anything or had questions on anything that you had gone through?
You know, it always amazes me how the patriarchs of the faith
Right.
were so broken too.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, and you think, you just think, well, those people God had chosen specifically for his plan, and yet, boy, they were dysfunctional families, all kinds of stuff too. So.
Oh yeah, when you read and you start getting into the life of Judah and his kids, when you see what Levi and did to the people, we're not quite there yet, but you see some of the actions, they're horrendous. Jacob, his name, heel catcher, deceiver, deceived his, and a lot of the times it's interesting because you'll find commentators a lot of the times who will try to whitewash or try to spiritualize some of the things that these patriarchs did because we want to make them holier than they really are. And I think that's a disservice both to the scripture, second of all, to the realism of how broken all of us are. And I actually find great comfort, not that David murdered somebody, but he was a murderer, but he was still considered someone after God's own heart. That those, I don't even want to call them foibles because that's but the disastrous rebels that we are, it brings comfort that even those, God, I mean, how many times both Isaac and Abraham both lie about their wives, putting them in a position that they could have been harmed. I mean, they were entered into harems. If it wasn't for God interceding, who knows what could have happened. So these were not men that always, but they were redeemed because they trusted.
Well, and just the
In
fact
the
that
one.
they lived how many centuries, how many years
Yes.
in the promised land with it full
Oh,
of
yeah.
heathen people.
Yep.
And how amazing it is that they even got through that and God preserved them.
Did, and it also shows the patience of God towards those. See, it also shows that God does not leave himself without witness. I think God was revealing his will some way or another to those nations that God said their sins are not yet full. We look at how Jonah went to Nineveh and how they repented. An interesting phenomena at the church service that's coming up this Sunday that I won't be a part of for the college students. I was supposed to teach on miracles, and so I've been helping Pastor with his arguments for miracles if there's people who come that have difficulties with that. And some of the research that's done, it's fascinating. There's a book, I'll have to get you the exact title of it, but he's a missionary. And 1 out of every 3 Muslims that are coming to Christ in places like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan, those places where proselytizing, if not illegal, is very dangerous to do, they're having constant dreams of Jesus. And then in the dream with Jesus is usually another person, a real person, that they end up seeing. So God is working miraculously in these places where Christ cannot be preached. And yes, the Muslims believe in Christ, but he is not the same Christ. There is no concept of forgiveness within Islam. So it is amazing. God is reaching out. So it also shows his preservation, and it also shows his mercy or common grace, even to those that aren't his, if we want to say, chosen. They're still his creation. So, yeah, Dean.
You say they believe in Christ, well, he has a different name then?
No, in the Muslim nations, he comes as Christ, but he is telling them things different than what Islam states. I mean, these are, well, Allah is the name, the Arabic name for God, but in Islam, there is the ultimate sin is shirk. Shirk is comparing anything to Allah. Allah is totally other. So when we say that Jesus is his son, we actually do the sin called shirk, comparing something created in their minds to something that is eternal. So when he's coming to them in their dreams, he is coming as the Christian Christ and telling them things like, you need to talk, or it comes in a variety of ways. Some of these people have had the same dream for months. So God is working in amazing ways. If people are wanting to know and to reach out, God will make himself known. So we get that from Paul's when he was on the Areopagus, when he was in Athens, and he said God has placed people in the times and the places that they are, so that some of them will reach out for God. So yeah, amazing things going on. But I think in the Old Testament, a lot of the times people forget about the grace. But here we have The reason that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob do not receive the land of the children of Israel is because, and he says this, because the sins of the Amorites are not yet full. He was still being patient with them. And he waited 400 years. So sometimes we see it as God is slack in keeping his promise. No, he's patient in those who are rebellious. And that's why. So a lot of the times it gives us a different perspective on our waiting. Maybe our waiting is not because God isn't there to answer our prayer, but we are already in Christ. And the thing that we're waiting for is because he is working with those who don't know him. I mean, a different perspective. Yeah. Any other questions over those, over the Bible?
So the Muslims, Mohammed is their leader on earth, as like Mormons have Joseph Smith or whatever.
Not quite the same. They believe in the Quran, and the Quran really is just a recitation. It's actually what was given to Allah by Gabriel, revealed to Gabriel, or revealed to Muhammad through Gabriel. So he never did anything miraculous. He did, and then also there are other books as well, similar to the Book of Mormon, where they have, different books like the life of Muhammad or different collected sayings. But it's interesting because unlike Mormonism, they don't have continuing revelation as far as I understand, where Mormonism still does have progressive revelation. In the sense that things can change. We see this with, the change in the priesthood in the 60s, or in, when they were looking at becoming a state, the change of polygamy. They can be revealed. Now, it's easy to say, they did it for convenience sake, and that may be the reason, but that's not what they'll claim. They'll claim that it was progressive revelation. There's a sociological book written by Alvin Schmidt. Alvin Schmidt was a sociologist. I think he was at Washington University in St. Louis. I may be wrong on that. He's actually a Lutheran sociologist, but he wrote a book called The American Muhammad, and it is a biography on Joseph Smith that looks at the similarities between him and Muhammad and how he caused his religion to take a foothold and how things were done. Joseph Smith, again, it was a revelation to him from, using the seer stones with the golden plates, similar to, and it's interesting because early in Muhammad's revelation, he thought they were jinns. He thought they were demons, what we would consider like malevolent spirits. And his wife convinced him that it was heavenly. And there's some disagreement on that as well, but very interesting stuff. Yep. All right. Pam, did you have any questions on any of those chapters through 35 in Genesis?
No, I don't.
Cool. Okay. All right. So then we will move on to, if we want to call it our primary text that we're using for discussion in that. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. So we are in chapter 3. In the beginning was a big surge. There was a great surge. And obviously, surge is an acronym that each of the letters stands for 5 different things. Okay, and starts with this great quote, and I love that picture of Einstein. But science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. And there's a lot of confusion on what actually he believed. Was he pantheistic? Was he, what actually did he believe? He obviously didn't believe in the Christian God. Or, with his ethnicity with a Jewish idea or concept. But he made some very interesting comments that we would put or make particular to design. And we're going to talk a little bit about it in a second, some of the preconceptions he had, even fudging some of his equations so that he did not get the result that he did not want, being a universe that had a beginning. Okay? So, one thing I want to start at the beginning of this. This is one area where there are certain things that we as young Earth creationists would agree with. Others that we would not agree with and actually have difficulty with, have maybe a different, if we want to call it understanding or interpretation of the scientific data. Now remember, data is data, but data really doesn't tell you anything. It has to be interpreted in light of a methodology. Okay, or in light of preconceived ideas sometimes. Hopefully we let the data speak, but it's within a framework that it really gains feet, if you want to call it. So what we're going to be looking at is on several of these, we would agree, like the Second Law of Thermodynamics, Einstein's theory of relativity. Those things that we as young Earth creationists, for the most part, and there's even some disagreement there, would agree with. Now, when I usually teach Surge, this is, as actually Robert Jastrow said, is that they've painted themselves into a corner, proving it by their own methods. So I use this because this is what evolutionists believe is true about the history of the cosmos. So you can also argue in the way that you argue with their assumptions. And you show that their assumptions prove your point, irregardless if you agree with all of them. But you're saying this is what you believe on point 1, point 2, point 3, point 4, and point 5. If we take your assumptions, it points to my conclusion. So you can argue that way as well. So when I teach this, usually I like to use this as this is using their own information against them. Now, as you get deeper in conversation with people and as your knowledge grows, then you can argue maybe from a position of the problems with the Big Bang, okay? Which Brian teaches on, we talk about, so there's different areas. But I wanted to make sure, and I'll hopefully go through and I'll tell you, yes, we would accept this as an argument from a young Earth perspective, or no, we have some issues with this. I may not necessarily get into the issues, but I just want to notate where there would be some disagreement. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so now when I was looking over chapter 3, there were a couple of things. Cosmological, so terms, and maybe you guys wrote down some words that you didn't know. And so usually, I think I've talked to you, I usually break up my paper when I take notes before we come into class. I always like to reread things because every now and then something new pops up. So I'll put at the top, and then I usually put terms. And I'll write down terms that I think people may not understand, or maybe even if I don't understand. Then I put thoughts and questions, and that's where I put my notes. So I kind of separate it. So a couple of the words, entropy. Do you know what entropy is? Sort of, somewhat?
I understood it when I read it.
Okay. Entropy is just going into disorder. It's how things fall into disarray and go into chaos. Okay, so that's a word that they may use. And so the second law sometimes can be described in two different ways. One is that it's the law of entropy, where things are going from an orderly state to a disorderly state. And in the process, they're losing usable energy. Okay, and so entropy, cosmological. So when we talk about the cosmological argument, really it's just referring to the beginning of the cosmos. Okay, so cosmological, just kind of putting those together. And then general relativity. Now, relativity, there's general relativity and special relativity, and probably for the extent of this class, they are theories of physics, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. There are theories in physics that seem to be the way the universe operates. Now, there's a lot of questions still involved with that. And so it alters a little bit of what we call Newtonian, or not, doesn't alter, but it's a different view than Newtonian physics. Now, Newtonian physics seems to work on macro objects. Is that correct? But it does not seem to pertain when we get really big or really small. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, but we won't go into great detail. But it's basically, really, we always have the equation E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Lot to it. I would highly recommend, how many of you subscribe to the great courses or have Amazon Prime? No one. Okay. On Amazon Prime, or you can just get a subscription to the great courses. I love it because I'm a nerd. But they have them on Einstein's theories of general and special relativity. And they're done by very renowned professors that understand the theories. Now, we may differ on implications. It's always a good way to learn. Because really, we're not going to get into relativity here. But these are just theories within physical science that seem to explain the interaction of, with gravity and different forces better than any other theory we have. Would that be a fair summation, Brian? Okay. All right. So, any other words that you, even after reading, was a little unsure of? Nope.
don't remember it.
Okay, cool.
But usually I look them up.
Well, and that's what I do as well. And sometimes, but even if they're used in a technical way, even when you look them up, it may not make sense. So if there ever is the case, just put it under your terms. Okay? Now, it's interesting. One of the things that the chapter talks about is that theories should be able to make predictions about the future, and that we should be able to corroborate. And I believe that. I actually think intelligent design gives us a model of understanding and predictability when it comes to fine-tuning of systems, of biological arguments that we're going to get into in the next chapters. So we're not going to go too deep into that, but I have no objection with that. But it's interesting. What did Einstein do when his equations started pointing to a absolute beginning of time, space, and matter? Do you guys remember?
He started to change the numbers and rework it so that it would fit what he believed, what he wanted it to say.
He added what was called the cosmological constant. This cosmological constant kept the universe static. At this time, the universe was seen as what? Well, not yet. Not yet. What was the view? And even, ironically, Newton, to a certain degree, believed this. Anybody on the tip of your tongue? They thought the universe was eternal. And if the universe was eternal, did the cosmological argument cause any problem? Because if the universe had never not existed, then does it fall into the cosmological argument? Think about that for a second. Does it? No, because cosmological argument only covers things that what? That what?
That didn't exist.
Yeah, that began to exist. It didn't exist before and began to exist. The cosmological argument needs a before cause or conditions for. But if the universe was eternal, so Einstein had the big problem, not from the science. What was his problem with? Creation, the theological implications. Because if there was a beginning of everything in the universe as we know it, that by definition brings in the supernatural. All supernatural means is that which is outside of and not contained in nature. Now it can permeate it, it can do other things, but it is outside. Because, and we all know, ex nihilo nihil fit, which means out of nothing, nothing comes. That is really self-evident. And it's interesting now because when you look at scientists trying to argue for a universe out of nothing, they never start with nothing. They always start with something. Whether it is a span of particles coming in and out of existence or even mathematical concepts, there's never nothing. Okay? Which makes it interesting. So that's why Einstein had a big problem with it. Because now You could not sit back on an eternal universe. You had to look for something outside of the universe as a cause. And really, how many options do we have? 2. We're either here by design or we're here by chance. Either we're here on purpose or a happenstance. But it's interesting because when we look at the characteristics of the universe, we start seeing what had to be in the thing that started it. We have personality. We have consciousness. We're in relationships. There's moral laws. Moral laws are only between sentient beings. Whether or not you're immaterial or material, it doesn't matter. Morality is relational, okay? Those things don't come out of rocks and atoms. So those causes. So we have a lot of implications. And there was a recent biography, Isaacs, I think is who wrote it, on Einstein. It's about 800 pages, but it's a great read if you're more interested in Einstein. Okay? So it looked like the universe was one giant effect. Okay? So really he gives the argument. Everything, and you guys can go, what page in your book is it on? That he actually gives the argument, the 2 premises and the conclusion.
It's on page 70.
Okay, 75. So if you're looking to Pam, it's on page 75. But when we look at it, it says the cosmological argument. Now, there are different variations of this. You can look at many different philosophers who have tweaked it a little different. We're just going to go with what's here. Everything that had a beginning had a cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe had a cause. Now, when we look at arguments, they have to be valid. Okay, that was in chapter 2. We're not going to get into too much detail. Hopefully you read on that. And the premises have to be true. Okay, so when we look at it, it is a valid argument. Okay, it's set up in a valid format that would give us a inescapable conclusion as long as the premises are true. Okay, so the first premise is everything that had a cause. What do we call this? There's actually, this is a law. Everything that had a beginning had a cause. Law of causation, law of causality. All of science is based on the law of causality. Without the law of causality, you have nothing. We even have a couple of quotes from some of the people that they talk about. We have Hume said, I never said anything as absurd a proposition as that something could arise without a cause. Now, he questioned if we could know the cause. And Bacon, that we get kind of the modern scientific method, true knowledge is knowledge by causes. So if anybody wants to deny premise number 1 as not true to reality, they undermine all of science. I think that's a pretty firm foundation that we can say premise number 1 is really undeniable. Okay, now we'll get into some other ways that people try to deny it. Okay, so the second one is the universe had a beginning. This is where people will try to fight. Now, until Einstein, they could fall back to an eternal universe, and this premise would be false. Going all the way back to Aristotle, it was seen, and one of the theories that came out was to prop it up, the steady state theory that Hoyle developed. Ironically, Hoyle, it says in our book as well, is the one who coined the term the Big Bang. More as a derogatory comment. But he finally, from my understanding, let go. Did you have a question?
No,
Oh, okay. No, and spit out if you do. So the second one is where we get the acronym SURGE. Okay? And so we'll go through that really quickly. So the S stands for the Second Law of Thermodynamics. The U stands for the universe is expanding. R stands for the radiation from the Big Bang. G stands for great galaxy seeds. And E stands for Einstein's theory of relativity. Okay? Now, really the first and the last are the ones that I do not think most young Earth creationists would object to. The 3 in the middle, there are some debate. about those, especially when it comes to the great galaxy seeds, because this actually takes into account the idea that gravity formed both the galaxies, the planetary systems, the solar systems, and we have a great series, and I don't know if Brian got into it, but they can't form naturally. And so this is where we would be arguing from what they hold to be true, not what we believe the science shows. Okay? So we'll just start with the first one. So premise number 2 then is verified or is shown to be true or more probable than not that it had a beginning by these things. First is the second law of thermodynamics. Okay? Now, we talked about it a little bit, but I think the best analogy he gives is he says it's kind of like the first law is that matter cannot be created or destroyed. It can change form, but it cannot be created or destroyed. Okay? Which I think there's a talk I do that shows that basically this is what happened on day 7 when God rested. That is when creation was done and the first law was firmly set. The fall, to a certain degree, now we have to be careful, because our body, when we digest food or certain mechanical processes, actually use the law of entropy. So there seems to be a possibility that God overcame that in instances where we wouldn't see the decay. But I think the fall had great implications on the effect of the second law as we see it now today. Okay? I'm not saying that it started at the fall. I'm saying something happened at the fall that allowed it so that it was now going to destroy everything as we see it from the curse. Okay? Does that make
Sort of.
So you're saying that energy or matter is destroyed? Or you're saying?
Well, our digestion process, and really when we look at certain things, the second law of thermodynamics is used in a lot of different processes. One of them is digestion. We know that we would have digested before the fall. We had plants. Now, how that process exactly looked, we don't know. But there were portions of the second law that were in operation. Many creationists believe that there was a superintending of God that kept it from causing the dissolution of what would eventually happen of the universe, what is called the heat death of the universe. The second law is moving us towards what we call the heat death of the universe. There's no more usable energy. Pretty much.
First law, you said
Oh,
it's neither created nor destroyed.
yes. So think of it this way. The second law of thermodynamics, you burn a piece of wood, it turns to ash. The ash is, so the energy and the matter has been changed. Nothing's lost, but it's been changed, and you have less usable energy. So we keep going down in usable energy that is able to do work, to the point that in the future we will hit absolute zero Kelvin, where there's no more energy to do. It's a frozen universe, the heat death of the universe. That is inevitable. Okay. Now, I don't think that was the case prior to the fall. The universe would have continued. Okay. So, yes.
I think something that might be causing a little confusion is
Yeah.
the definition of the first law is somewhat incomplete, I believe. He says the first law is that the total amount of energy in the universe is constant. I think that he's leaving out is the total amount of energy and mass.
Right.
is
Right. It's, and I can't remember, I should have written it down, gotten a textbook, but the way I've always seen it represented is matter cannot be created or destroyed, but transformed or changed form. So energy, that's what E equals mc squared. It shows that relationship of energy to mass. So the equation always balances, but you may have more energy, and eventually that energy will be zero. And does that make sense to everybody? Yes, that's what entropy. Well, yep, everything is winding down to not being able to. And so the way he puts it forth, which I think is very good, it's very similar. The first law of thermodynamics tells us that matter and energy is finite. There is a set amount, and it's not increased. So, similar to the size of your gas tank in your car, you have a finite amount. So if your car is running and you have a finite amount of gas, could it have started an infinite time in the past? The answer is no. It would have ran out of gas by now. So the second law of thermodynamics really shows that we have a finite beginning, however far we want to go back or can calculate, but we have a finite beginning of the universe because there's still a large amount of usable energy. And if the universe was infinitely old, it would be dead. Is that making sense to everyone? So this shows the need for a starting point. Again, our first point, the universe had a beginning. We're trying to support premise number 2. Okay? The universe is expanding. Now, we have people within the young earth creationist community that do believe that it's expanding. We have others that believe that the red shift and the blue shift is not what we think it is. And there's even actually secular scientists. What was the gentleman's name? Halton Arp, who does not believe. So it's not just creationists that are trying to decide or understand what the red shift and blue shift. We have anomalies that seem very weird and seem to defy the expanding universe theory. Okay? But I will say it's mostly held. I would say, I don't know of any evolutionist other than some select ones. I would say it's the vast majority believe that the universe is expanding. Now, when we look biblically as well, we hear about God stretching out the heavens, which could give a similar effect. And so these are things that sometimes are very difficult. But again, we're arguing from their standpoint. I have not delved into it enough. From my understanding, I think the universe is expanding. I don't necessarily have a problem with that because it could have started, and as God says, then he stretched it out. It could have been that process that is causing the expansion. So there's many ways that we can look at that. But their point that they make when we're arguing for the beginning of the universe is that if you infer it backwards, there is a point when you collapse into nothing. Okay? So also, Einstein's theory, which we'll get to, which kind of kicked off the whole process, even though it's the E, so we get to it last, it both predicted that there would be expansion. And it also predicted, and this I don't think Einstein said, but somebody else said that it would predict the afterglow radiation. So it really comes back to, Einstein starting this out, and then Sir Arthur Eddington in 1919 actually giving the first verifiable proof that his law of general relativity was true, or seemed to be true. Okay? So the U is the universe expanding. Pretty easy to understand. Okay?
Can I ask?
Yeah.
Maybe I'm losing all here. The universe expanding, isn't that against the first law of thermodynamics, or did I miss it?
No. The first.
Matter and energy are finite. Finite means you can increase, it's there.
Space is not, primarily what is expanding is space. The amount of matter has not increased. And that's what's hard to understand from the Big Bang theory. The universe is not expanding into empty space. Space is expanding with matter. There's nothing there, so there's no space. It's both space and time. Everything had their beginning, and then this Big Bang, as they call it, and it has caused the expansion, and it's continuing. And there's many that say that that actually is accelerating, or at least their measurements seem to show that the universe is actually accelerating in its expansion. So yeah, so that is not, so it doesn't defy the second law. Yep. So this was really Hubble in the late 1920s. There was another gentleman that was working on it before him, but Hubble really put it together first. Einstein even actually went to Mount Wilson above LA. I don't even know if you can even see out of that telescope anymore with all the haze in LA. I wonder, and you have a huge, but anyways, that's beside the point. So you have Hubble seeing what we see as redshift. And his interpretation and understanding is that that is everything moving away from everything else, which would make sense if the universe started in a Big Bang. Okay? So we can use that to show this is something that they assume to be correct. And again, these are areas that I think we're taking a brief overview. There's much more depth in all of these areas. And I really encourage you in areas that you have a proclivity to or something that really interests you, dig into those areas and help. The next one is radiation from the Big Bang, what they call cosmic background radiation. And what they basically say is that if the universe started in a Big Bang, there would be a remnant. And I think we all know that when we look at the stars, it's looking at the past because there is time travel that allows for that light to come. Now, there's different theories regarding how fast it can travel, all these other things. We won't get into that. But it does take time to travel. And so we are looking into the past. And so what they see is that there is this uniform radiation. I think it's like at 2.5 Kelvin or something like that. That is throughout. And so they believe it is the effects, kind of the background radiation from the Big Bang. No longer can see it because the wavelengths are so small, but it can still register heat. But there's actually a creation scientist who believes that this is just, if you want to call it the uniform temperature of the universe, including everything. And he calculated it actually better than originally they thought this background radiation, the temperature would be. So there's other ways, of course, of looking at it. But again, from an evolutionary standpoint, from a cosmic evolutionary standpoint, this is held to be true. We saw several quotes in your book about how this was the holy grail of cosmology. Stephen Hawking said that this was the greatest find of the 20th century. Okay, so a lot of these. This was in the 60s, and it was two guys, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson. It was in 65. They were working for Bell Laboratories. Okay, so what it is it supposedly is the background radiation that they anticipated to see and they found. Now, the next one is associated with it. When they started looking at these background radiation, they believed that there had to be basically a fine-tuning and that there would be ripples. These ripples would have slightly greater mass so that the galaxies could form. Now, I have many problems with galaxy formation from an evolutionary standpoint. I don't think it can take place. I remember even Brian having a conversation with a physicist that works for another organization that basically believes in these evaluations. And when Brian asked him for details, he pretty much said, we don't have anything. He was candid, which is great. But he still believes that the propensity of evidence points to it, even though they don't have all the details worked out. But really, the devil is in the details when we look at it. Okay? So they believe then that the universe had these areas that supposedly Kobe found, and then later what was called the W map in 2003 became more precise, that even to the point that they say you're seeing the machining effects of God. Okay? Because if the Big Bang is true, if you expand too quickly, gravity, according to their theory, can't pull together things, so we have stars and galaxies and planets and all that. If it doesn't expand fast enough, then you have the Great Crunch, where everything then comes back and just collapses, and you have, for lack of a better term, you have a black hole, basically, and nothing else. Okay? So we aren't, and there's other things that it gets into. So is everybody following okay? Understanding from good. Okay, stunning. Now the last one is Einstein's theory of relativity. Now, there are a couple of astrophysicists. One of them is he Tasmanian or is he Australian? Hartnett. He actually has some different theories. He works with another gentleman, and some of it is in a book called Dismantling the Big Bang. So there are some alternative theories that challenge some of the premises of special and general relativity. I don't think it does wholesale with them, but it has some tweaks and variations, okay? But Einstein's theory of relativity, again, he talks about in the book that it's been proved to the 5th decimal spot that it demands an absolute beginning for time, space, and matter. Okay? They are correlative, which means they're interdependent. I actually, and this is something I'd love for somebody to think about, when we've given analogies for the Trinity, a lot of people say that the Trinity is non-rational or irrational. It may not. But what I compare it to is I said, look at the universe. We have one reality, but it's made up of space, time, and matter. Time is not space. Space is not matter, and matter is not time. But they all coexist together. It's one reality, but three, if we want to call it, items. And so I use that sometime as a rough analogy to the Trinity. We have one God in three persons. Well, that's a contradiction. No. We have one reality and three things that compose it. So just something to think about. I haven't fleshed it out, but I think it's fairly interesting. But Einstein basically said an absolute beginning. This is a nail in the coffin. Jastrow, who is the director, or was the director at Mount Wilson, he founded the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Study. These are some of the quotes he had in there. It says, "We now know that supernatural forces are at work. It's a scientifically proven fact." Now, he's an agnostic. I'm not sure where he stands now, but obviously you can't doubt his credentials. He is. Now, people will try to. It's interesting when a world-renowned atheist came out and said that he now is a deist. First thing they say is, I think I read like 5 or 6 rebuttals of his book. Not a single one dealt with the arguments. Every single one said he's old. It's really his co-author that put the words into his mouth. He's not understanding this. It was all ad hominems. Okay? And so we need to know, there are great, those who may not agree with us theologically, but scientifically. So he goes on and he says that we were painted into a corner. We've proven it by our own methods. Again, that's how we're arguing. Now, the one thing that I want to stress, and he stresses in the book, is that he is finding this through scientific investigation, through inferential reasoning. It's consistent with religion, but we are not coming to the conclusions because of our theological positions. It is concordant with it. And I think that's huge, because most people say, well, you're a creationist, and so you put your creation before science. Well, I believe there are different types of revelation, and I actually can come to the conclusion that there needs to be a God purely from scientific reasons, the desire for the supernatural. Okay? Now, he goes on and he talks about many theories that fail, and he goes into that. We won't go into the book. One thing I want to say is that there are some who try to doubt premise number 1, which is the law of causality. And they usually bring up the uncertainty principle. And he does stress it in the book. All the uncertainty principle does, and it's a confusion between what we can know and what is true. I like how he puts it. He puts that it confuses causality with predictability. Because really all the uncertainty principle tells us is that we can't tell its speed and location with accuracy at the same time. We either give up our a better understanding of its velocity, or we give up a better understanding of its position, but that doesn't mean it's uncaused. So again, I don't think anything takes away these two, okay? So I believe that premise number one, law of causality, is really undeniable, okay? He even goes to the point, he says, if somebody says they deny the law of causality, it undermines rationality, because we use cause and effect to reason through things. How did you come to that conclusion? If we undermine the law of causality, you lose everything. You absolutely lose everything. And I think any of us with any common sense knows that that's not how it works. Okay? So, he goes on, if the Big Bang is falsified, there's still many ways. Second Law of Thermodynamics, Einstein's theory. He goes into some geological ideas with radioactivity as well. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take a break right now. I'm going a little longer today because I think it's a pretty good argument. And since we didn't have anybody here when we handed out the surveys, no one did any surveys. So what we'll do is we'll finish this up. After the break, we'll just talk quickly about the Kalam cosmological argument, which is a philosophical argument, more so than a scientific argument, okay? And we'll go into then tactics, our tactic book, okay? So why don't we take a couple-minute break, come back in about 5-6 minutes, and then we'll move on. Are you doing okay, Pam?
Yes, I sure am.
Awesome. Okay. So we're going to just take a couple-minute break and then we'll be back. What I'll do is just really briefly, the Kalam a lot of the times confuses people. It comes from the Arabic word for eternal. So it's called the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Probably the most extensive work that's been done on this has been done by William Lane Craig. He actually has a book, and it's a very good book, on the cosmological argument, and that's specifically what it focuses on. Most of the debate usually revolves around his formulation of the argument. So if anybody wants that book, it's pretty heavy, but you can get through it. And I think the cosmological argument is one of the most powerful arguments. Now, we've talked about it before, that none of these are drop-dead arguments per se. Personally, I think many of them are, but we use cumulative case. It's not we have one argument, and you'll actually see, I won't go through all 24 of them, but there was a presentation that was done by Alvin Plantinga. He's a Christian philosopher, really caused a resurgence of Christian philosophy, brilliant philosopher. Taught at Notre Dame, but he had a lecture that he said 24 or so evidences for or arguments for the existence of God. Some of them are kind of out there. I mean, difficult to understand. Others are very, very practical. But again, I think it's a cumulative argument. Okay? So Kalam, this is basically what it says. An infinite number of days has no end. That's premise number one. Premise number two is, but today is the end day of history. Therefore, there were not an infinite number of days before today. Okay? It's kind of like he goes in and he makes the example. He says, if time is infinite in the past, we would never get to today. Okay? But we are at today. So there had to be a finite beginning. He also goes in and he says, if you have an infinite number, you can't add to it. Well, tomorrow we'll be adding to the number of days. So this is more of a cosmological argument, or more of a philosophical argument, dealing with the idea of infinity. We can have infinity in abstract concepts when it comes to mathematical equations, but when it comes to reality, that is not possible. You can in an equation have an infinite number of days, but in reality, in concrete reality, you cannot bypass an infinite number of days. Even when we go into eternity, it's still not infinite. We didn't start, we had a definite beginning, and we are adding. Now, reckoning may seem a little different, but days will continue to add. We will be never ending, but we will not be infinite. Does that make sense?
Not exactly.
That's okay. That's okay.
And there is a difference. That's why never ending is different from infinite.
God being infinite,
Yes, which means he has no boundaries. He has
but
no.
his reality.
Yes, he is. But infinite in that sense. But we're talking about infinite events, not an infinite being. Yeah. So we're talking about occasions or events, products, lack of a better term. You see the difference? Yes. And that's also why we can get into the argument and say that there can't be multiple gods, because then they can no longer be infinite because they are bounded by those other gods. So we're not going to get into it now, but these are some of the things that do take a little brain running through it. Sometimes it'll click, sometimes you'll just look starry-eyed. But it's something to learn to wrap your mind around. He gives the example, too, that we could constantly magnify and subdivide the distance between two books. We could constantly divide it half. You've heard about that parable where, if you go half the distance and half the distance and half the distance, you never get there. But in reality, that's not the case. You cannot put an infinite number of books between the two books. Does that make sense? So the big thing I want you to take away is infinite is good and usable when we're dealing with abstract concepts, equations, but in reality, an infinite number of anything does not exist, cannot exist. So an infinite number of days cannot. And the argument is very simple. Infinite by definition means that there is no end to it. But today is the end of history. So we have an end, therefore it cannot be infinite. Okay? So just think about it. Most of the time when I tell people that argument, their head spins. I remember teaching in a high school class, and one of the girls stopped me in the middle of my presentation. She said, "Whoa." She said, "Let me take that in because that changes everything." And I said, "It does." And she says, "That's just hurting my mind." And she actually was somebody, I ended up continuing to have a engagement with her. And she called me afterwards and she said, "I am a Christian, or was a Christian, that have now become atheist, but you're making me rethink." I gave her some books. 6 months later, she texted me and said, "Would you like your books back? I'm again a Christian." And I told her, "Nope, you keep the books." But she was the one that this Kalam cosmological argument just really hit her. Now, I don't know specifically why it was so impactful, but it was for her. Okay? Now, it comes down to the last question. And you hear people like Richard Dawkins. You have even people like Bertrand Russell who have said, well, if everything that begins to exist has a cause, then God, who made God? And that's a misunderstanding of the argument. Why is it a misunderstanding of the argument? What does the first premise of the cosmological argument say? Whatever begins to exist has a cause. God did not begin, so therefore he does not need a cause. Now, usually the atheist or the naturalist will come back and say, well, why can't I pick the universe? Well, out of options, that is an option, that the universe can be infinite. Can be that eternal, forever, never having a beginning. But that's what the whole chapter was about. The whole chapter was to show that it is undeniable. Even Stephen Hawking and everyone else, it's undeniable pretty much now that the universe had a beginning. Okay? So, The reason the universe can't be eternal is because of surge, because of the Kalam, and other arguments. We didn't even get into all the arguments you could get to. Okay? Think of it this way. And he talks about it in the book. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there anything? Because if there was any time in the past where there was nothing, there would be nothing today. So why is there something rather than nothing? Something has to be eternal. There's really only two options: the universe or something that made the universe. So really, and that's why I think many of these scientists, he even gets into it. Jastrow says it's really interesting when these scientists get so, upset about mathematical equations. Well, they're not mad at the mathematical equations. They're mad at the ramifications. Because if you have two options and one option fails scientifically and the other option is not what you want, kind of sucks. It's almost the Freudian thing going on the other foot. They always say that Christians are Christians because they can't handle the futility of a universe and they want a sugar daddy up in the sky. Well, really what we're finding out is that atheists don't want there to be a God. So that sword cuts both ways. Okay. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Relative to the column, it's helpful for me to be able to differentiate the terms time and history. Because history is everything in the past
Right.
up till now.
Right.
But time will continue on.
Yes, we move with time. It is that present moment kind of that we move with. Yep.
So time doesn't stop,
No.
but history does.
Yes, but history does. Yep. Good clarification. Okay, so God is not something that was made. Something has to be eternal. And since the universe has lost it, really the only other plausible option is some kind of supernatural causation. And as we get through the book, of course, we haven't made the arguments for why it's the Christian God. Everything up until this point is basically showing that we are consistent with the scientific findings with what we believe. So when we look at this, truth about reality is knowable. The opposite of true is false. It is true that the theistic God exists. This is evidenced by the beginning of the universe. So we're taking it step by step. First, we go from pure skepticism to show that to deny truth is self-defeating. Truth is undeniable. Then we learn this idea of the law of non-contradiction. The opposite of true is false. So if we know something is true, then anything opposed to it is false. We are gaining in just simple mental exercises that help us to find the truth. So these are consistent with theistic belief, and I think very inconsistent with materialistic belief, because I don't think you have a ground for rationality, a ground for morality, a ground for consciousness, many other things. Okay? So we are at the beginning of the universe, the cosmological argument. We're going to get into the design of the universe. We're going to get into the design of life. We're going to get into the moral law. Okay? And those are what are part of our cumulative case for showing that the theistic view of the universe. Now remember, he gave us three views. There is theism, which is God. He uses the analogy of a painting. God made the painting. We have atheism, which says no one made the painting. It just exists. And pantheism, where God is the painting. He really breaks it down into those three. And I've seen other logicians and theologians break down that almost all religions, if not all of them, fall into those three categories. Okay? So what we're showing is that if theism is true, the other ones are not going to be true. And we're going to continue to grow on that. Okay? So we will end with that. Why are you clicker not working now? There we go. So, any final questions on that chapter of I don't have enough faith to be an atheist? No? Okay. Then the last one we will move on to is tactics. basically, we're going to go over this really quick because I think it's fairly easy to understand. Are you finding it pretty easy to understand?
Yeah,
Okay. Except?
it is. Except as we go along, I'm trying to make it a little note.
Oh, don't make a note. I have a cheat sheet for you. That actually, and Pam, I will get this to you when I see you next time. It's actually an insert for your Bible.
Oh,
It has everything within the book.
okay.
Yes. Yes. And I also want to recommend, if you have a smartphone, Stand to Reason, the organization that Greg Kokel helped found and is basically the president of, I believe. They have 2 apps. That one is called Quick Reference Guide. So like arguments against abortion, arguments for God. They have it, so like the Cosmological Argument, it gives you all the premises. And so their website as well. But I can supply that. So if you go on like the App Store or the Google Store or whatever and look for Stand to Reason or STR, it should show the apps available. I would grab both of them. There should be 2 of them. Okay? So he goes into Columbo. Columbo's step 1 is just gathering information. What an easy thing to do. Gather information. You're not making any propositions. You're not making any claims. You're not having to support. You're gathering information. The goal is to gather in as many questions as you can. It's engaging. You're in friendly conversation. People like to talk about themselves most of the time. And it's clarifying because you start understanding what they think, they believe. So he goes in and he says, clarifying questions give clarity because, first of all, we don't want to misunderstand them because then it doesn't make the conversation go real well. We don't want to misrepresent them. This causes us to build up straw man arguments where we believe we know. They said they were Buddhist. So we have some assumptions in our mind. And so we are now going to give the best argument against Buddhism. But since we didn't ask clarifying questions, that person doesn't believe that type of Buddhism. So you've just defeated a idea that they don't have. It's a waste of time. It also misses the point. It's very frustrating for both parties. We speak past each other, okay? And the last one, it says, it helps them to understand themselves. We find this on the college campus a lot. Most people have not thought through these topics. So we need to be gracious and give time for people to think, because when you ask questions, what do you mean by that? All of a sudden they're like, well, I've used the word God forever. I don't know what I mean by God. They haven't, so you're causing them to think about what they believe and clarify for themselves. Because a lot of the times they have not. Okay? So, this is the first question. And there's other groups that have presented these questions in different ways. Simple Tools for Brain Surgery uses a lot of these same questions, but differ in how they present them. But really the question is, what do you mean by that? And obviously you don't say that every single time. You vary it depending on the conversation. But when you ask, what do you mean by that? You're getting more information so you fully understand exactly what their statement meant. Okay? So that's really Columbo tactic number 1. Now he goes in and he says, use this. He said, for a couple of weeks, don't even worry about any of the other steps. When you get into conversation, just start using that. Well, tell me more about that. What do you mean by that? I'm not sure if I quite understand. Vary it however you want. Okay? Because the more information you have about what someone believes, is it going to be good or bad? Good. And all questions, if you ask clarifying questions, you're bound to grow in your knowledge of the person. I mean, they may say, I don't know, but you still gain in knowledge knowing they're claiming things that they don't know why they believe them. Okay? So the question will always move to more important info. one thing that we want to do, don't jump in blindly. That's why we ask the questions. We don't want to make assumptions. We want to know what they believe. And so what do you mean by that? Helps clarify definitions and positions. Okay? We also need to know and truly listen. I think that, to a certain degree, is a lost art form. Truly listen. And a lot of the times, I know when I was going through a lot that I went through coming back to Christ, one of the exercises I had to do in recovery with my sister is I had to repeat what she said to me. So, sis, this is what it sounds like you're saying to me. Ironically, I was surprised at how many times it came back, no, that's not what I meant. Wow, I thought I understood you, and we don't. So sometimes it is just, it may not be what do you mean by that. It says, let me make sure I'm understanding you correctly. This is what, again, it's clarifying. That's always showing honor and intent or good intent towards the person as you try to figure out more about them. You're showing interest, okay? Make sure it's sincere interest. You know, some days are better than others, but, you know, and obviously, he says this is the first step because without information, you don't know where to go to next. If you're trying to discuss really important issues with people, unless you know where they stand, you're shooting in the dark. Last thing that he presents is don't go to complete the sale. All we're trying to do is put a stone in someone's shoe. You're not going to be able to convince them. Now, maybe the conversation will move that way. Maybe they'll ask questions. Maybe they'll open up. But don't force it. Really, it's a little bit. I like the analogy he gives. He says, if it's a closed door to Christ, and Christ is using apologetics to remove obstacles, sometimes you're only opening that door a slight bit. But still, it's opening a little bit. And if you push it, sometimes it can get shoved closed again. So don't force it. Let it flow as it goes. Any questions on kind of the Colombo step number one? Again, I think it's pretty self-explanatory, and it is a skill worth developing. And how do you develop a skill? Practice. You are going to have to use it, or it doesn't become second nature. Okay? Yes?
Guys, did you put something back to them on what they said? They might have second thoughts about what they said or something.
Possibly. Or they could say, well, yeah, that is how it sounded. But that's not really what I believe. It sounds different when it comes back to me. You know, they may. And it's really good. And I found out when I did that, because I have a very bad habit of my mind wandering. It just does. And so I'll be talking to somebody, and before I know it, I'm like, I have no idea what that person just said. I was thinking about something over here. So it helps me to focus as well if I know that I'm going to clarify it with them. And so...
You're eating lobster at the beach, too?
Yeah, what? That's a pretty neat place you're going to, squirrel. So, Dave.
Seems to be so important. You know, people have warped views of reality.
Right.
Their worldview is warped. And I see kind of an analogy between that and a warped board. Yeah, you can straighten a warped board if you know how it got there.
Yeah.
But
No.
you can't straighten out a warped mind unless you know how it got there.
That's
That's exactly right. What brought it to that position? So yes, and I think that's very good. And I like analogies. You guys get in the store or get in the habit of using stories, analogies, metaphors. It really helps in learning. It really helps put new perspective on it. Okay?
It has to do with sports.
Yes. And baseball for me. Yes. So, chapter 5 is Colombo step number 2. This is called reversing the burden of proof. This, really what I want you to get out of this is that he who makes the claim has the burden of proof to prove it. What happens is a lot of the times is we as Christians, we become defensive. So somebody will make up a just so story and say, well, here's a possible explanation. And he goes in, he says, when people give you possible explanations, the first thing you need to do is first think about, is it possible? If it is possible, then is it plausible? And then is it probable? And the only way you can determine that is asking questions, what's the evidence? So really, question number 2 is, he calls it a bedside story, but I love it. What he says is, where did I put it? Well, how did you come to that conclusion? I don't know where I wrote it. Or what was the reason? What are your evidences? Where did that come from? He even goes to the point that you give them the benefit of the doubt. Assume that they've studied it. Don't go in going, I'm going to ask this question and make them look like a total idiot. May end up happening. But when you come to them, always come to them in the most gracious way you can. So, you came to the conclusion that morality is not needed, or God is not needed for morality. Are there specific books you read? What are some of the strongest arguments that you have for it? Assume that they've thought about it. Now, if it comes back, which a lot of the times it does, that they're deer in the headlight kind of look, give them time, be gracious. I've even at times when I've talked to people, if I see that they're stumbling, I say a lot of the times, I'll come up and I say, it's kind of hard sometimes when you're on the spot. I've heard people defend it this way, and I'll actually give them a little bit of an argument to help them out. Just because if you really humiliate them, you've lost the battle. So we need to make sure that we don't do that. However, we can be gracious to them. Also, never kick someone when they're down. Don't keep piling on. If they're not being able to answer their questions and they're getting flustered, change subjects. Do something else. The opportunity is past. Okay? But a lot of the times people will come up and say, well, it's possible, and then we all of a sudden try to defeat their argument. But we didn't make the claim. We need to make them carry the burden and say, well, how did you come to that conclusion? What are your arguments? And let them defend their position. We don't have to become defensive, okay? So again, questions even at the point of that. Now, when we make claims, do we need to defend it? Oh yeah, we do. I like, and I'm pretty sure he gets this from Francis Schaeffer, but an argument is like a house. The conclusion is the roof. The walls hold up the conclusion. If the walls can't hold the conclusion, you don't have a house. You don't have an argument. And so always make them tell you what supports their conclusion. Okay? And force them. It may be uncomfortable for them. I like the line he says, where did he put? First, an alternative explanation is not a refutation. Where did I put it? Most critics are eager to attack, but they're not prepared to defend. And so when we have a lot of people that are antagonistic towards us, if they're jumping all over us, they're making the claims. We just have to say, okay, so I'm understanding you correctly that you think that Christianity is irrational. How did you come to the idea that belief in God is irrational? You've told me it's irrational. Now I'm just asking you to help me understand why you think that. And turn it back on them. He calls it reversing the burden of proof. Okay? In Simple Tools for Brain Surgery, it's more of the evidential route. You're looking for the evidence that supports. Both are doing the same thing. I like the reversing the burden of proof because it brings to mind he who makes the positive argument has to make the supportive arguments. Okay? And again, an argument is not an opinion. An opinion is not an argument. An argument has evidential basis. It has thought behind it. It has whether you're using first principles of logic and evidence, inferential thinking, deductive reasoning, there is a process. An opinion is just asserted. Okay? And we need to make sure that people don't get away with expressing opinions as arguments. Does that make sense? All right. Again, it's not a trick. Okay? And you may. I love what he says. He said he had one individual that he was debating with, and he said the individual was very candid. He didn't have any reasons. And I loved his follow-up question. His follow-up question is, why would you believe something you have no reason to think is true? It's a very pointed question, but I think it's a very valid question. Okay? All right. So, any thoughts on this?
There's a lot to do, and like you said, just need to step in and start practicing, and that's a big step sometimes.
What I have done with some of my students as well is I'll have them do surveys, and they'll do the survey usually in like black ink. Then what I have them do is then in blue ink, I have them go and work on how they could have furthered the conversation by additional questions. So in blue are questions that they could ask. So they're, even though the experience and the time is gone, they're still practicing and they're thinking through it. Then I also have them do mock arguments. What they do is then they'll say, oh, I've heard people respond to it this way. So they ask a question, they anticipate a response, and then they respond to that. So it's almost like they're creating a dialogue, just like kind of practicing dribbling at home. You're not in a game, you're dribbling. When you hear conversations, like we overhear conversations all the time, use that as an opportunity to say, if I was in a conversation with that person, what would be my next step? Would I gather information, or have I heard enough? Would I, reverse the burden of proof, and we'll get into more. The next step we'll get into is directing the conversation. Okay? I do that all the time. You do have to be careful because sometimes it can, and he does give the example. You're an idiot. If your wife says that, you don't want to come back and say, well, what brought you to that conclusion? Because she may answer you, and you would know. So, obviously the appropriate place and time and that. So, all right. Any other thoughts or questions for tonight? May close a little early.
I find myself trying to not necessarily reconcile, but coordinate what we are reading in the two books. I don't have enough faith. They talk about the
Roadrunner tactic.
tactic,
Yes.
and that is recognizing and
Self-defeating arguments.
telling people, well, your argument is self-defeating.
Right.
Sometimes that's hard to recognize.
Very much so.
And then to coordinate that with, what do you mean by that? And what led you to that understanding or that conclusion?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like sports, using your analogy. Baseball, the primary thing is you hit a ball, you field a ball, and you catch a ball. That kind of stuff. Throw, you have the basics. But then you have the intricacies. You have the, infield fly rule. You have now the foul lines. It is definitely something that through repetition, it eventually integrates well. It just takes time. Is that kind of what you're saying?
What the situation is.
Right. Yep. And you will find out, and Greg even says that. He goes back all the time. I should have said this. Oh, I forgot to ask that question. It's easy to write I'm not going to say it's easy to write a book, but when you write a book, you have editors, you have that, and you look through it. When you're on the spot, usually not so smooth. A lot of times what I do is I say a quick prayer in my head, before the conversation. Similar to, I always think of Nehemiah, right before he went in to talk to King Artaxerxes, and lift up a prayer, let God guide and direct you. You've prepared yourself, and just try to let go. But it does. And it'll even get more confusing because the Roadrunner tactic is what you'll learn in this book is called the suicide tactic. He calls it. So we're going to reiterate some things, but I think the best thing right now is to think of the I don't have enough faith to be an atheist as the informative, and the tactics as the methodological, even though they're going to overlap some. And that's why I like the two books, because I think the information and the resources in I Don't Have Enough Faith is stupendous. And the methodology throughout the book of tactics is, I think, coupled together. But yeah, it's going to take a while to mesh. Yep. And that's with anything. Yeah.
We're going to be then, not next week, but the week after, we're going to be discussing I Don't Have Enough Faith, chapter 4.
And 5. Because we'll go 2 weeks. So just remember, it's a chapter a week.
Right.
And then whatever it is through the week before, so it's probably 4 chapters because we're reading about 2 chapters a week in tactics.
Okay.
They're shorter chapters and not as dense. Yep. And then keep up on the Bible reading. Yep. And again, you guys, if you don't get through it, just come anyways. We'll talk about it. You'll learn something. So don't get stressed if life gets busy. Okay?
So then what's the book studies? Is that other books that we have?
No, you can use that for these books. Yeah. It's more for you individually so that you can think, what were the top 3 premises? Is there something that I disagreed with the author about? Is there something that I had questions about? That's kind of what those, why did they name the chapter the way they did? It's just to get the juices flowing. Yep. So use it to your own advantage. If you're finding yourself stuck, you can't think of questions or whatever may be the case, use that worksheet and it should generate some ideas. And I'll send that to you, Pam.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right. Well, why don't we close with prayer and then we will have a good night. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord God, I do thank you so much for those that have gone before us and those minds that have put together the materials that we're using. Lord God, I thank you for the blessing of all that you give us. I pray that as we go through these books, you would help us to integrate it into our thought life. I pray that you would help us as we practice it. You would pour out your mercy and grace on us. And Lord, I pray that you would help us to see that it is so easy to plant stones in people's shoes. Lord, I pray that you would be with everybody as we are separated for the next 2 weeks. I pray that you would just guide and direct us all. So now, Lord, we give this night to you and our time to you. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.